traffic light at the junction of Ogui Road and Chime Avenue held red for 4 minutes and 11 seconds on a Wednesday morning in the third week of November. Kola Adeyemi had his phone out, a contract addendum from his attorney in Lagos, requiring a response before noon when his driver braked and the car stopped. He looked up from habit. 11 meets through the window. On the pavement near the gutter, a woman with a gray head and a faded blue apron was arranging oranges on a wooden table beneath a yellow parasol. The parasol had a split seam along the right panel where the sun came through in a straight line across her shoulder. She picked up 3 oranges, weighed them in one hand, set them down with precision, and then used the other hand to straighten a bunch of plantains by the stem, slowly, carefully, the way someone straightens a student's paper on a desk before the examination begins. Kola set the phone face down on his knee. He had not been to Enugu in 12 years. He had not seen the woman who once taught him mathematics in 17. And across all of that time, all the distance and all the things that had changed between then and now, she had never once called him to ask for a single thing. Her full name was Mrs. Constance Monica Achebe. She was 67 years old and stood 5 feet and 3 inches in the flat. Rubber sandals she wore to the market each morning, down 2 sizes from the leather court shoes she had worn in the classroom for 3 decades, because the court shoes had worn through at the ball of both feet in 2019, and replacement ones cost more than 4 days of fruit sales. She weighed what a person weighs after eating 1 full meal a day for 14 months and calling it an adjustment. She had taught mathematics and English language at government secondary school in Enugu for 31 years. She had first walked into that school on the 2nd day of January 1982, 22 years old, with a chalk-stained notebook under one arm and a protractor in the other. She had left, or been made to leave, on the last working day of June 2013, 58 years old, after a letter arrived signed by a man named Mr. Gerald Obi, Director of Human Resources, informing her that the institution was restructuring its staffing profile to better serve the needs of a modern curriculum, and that her services would no longer be required. The letter was one of 47, signed by Gerald Obi over 3 days. She had never met Gerald Obi. None of the teachers who received those letters had ever met Gerald Obi. She wore a faded blue apron over a wrapper she had owned for 11 years, dark blue with a pattern of yellow triangles that had faded to creamette, the edges from washing. In the front pocket of the apron she carried a small exercise book, brown-covered, water-stained at the lower left corner, now on its 3rd refill insert. In it she kept her daily sales in the block print that 31 years of classroom blackboards had made automatic. Date, items purchased, quantity sold, revenue, expenditure, profit or loss. She was never off by more than 50 naira. She never needed to recount to be sure. Her daughter Adeze, who worked as a nurse in Port Harcourt, sent 15,000 naira each month without fail, sometimes 20,000 when she could manage it. It was not enough, and they both knew it, and had stopped discussing it the previous March, when Adeze's hospital had cut the nursing auxiliary allowance, and Constance had told her on the phone that she was managing fine. The landlord on Obiagu Road, a man named Chukwemeka, who collected rent on the 1st of every month and fixed nothing, had raised her rate from 40 naira to 65,000 naira in January and given her until the end of November to pay the new amount or vacate. She had 41 naira saved in a tin above the kitchen cabinet. The difference between 41,000 and 65 was a number she had stopped running in her head because the answer was always the same number. She had been at the fruit table for 4 years. She bought her stock each morning from a wholesaler near the Ogi Road roundabout before 7 a.m. Oranges, plantains, bananas, garden eggs, sometimes pawpaw when she could source them at 300 naira for 3, and sold through the day until the orange light came on above the junction and the heat eased off the pavement. Her spot was near the gutter at the edge of the pavement where the smell in the wet season came up bad. Mama Naneka, the woman who sold pepper and crayfish from a mat 3 meters to her left and had held that same spot for 11 years, had offered once to share the better position. Constance had declined politely and not raised it again. Mama Neka had known Constance for 4 years and did not know she had been a teacher. What she knew from 4 years of adjacent commerce was that Constance was the only woman on that stretch who counted change by adding up from the crotch price rather than subtracting down from the note, who never rounded against the customer, and who had once told a man who underpaid by 50 naira, pleasantly, with her hands at her sides. "I think that is not quite right. Check again." The man had looked at his own coins and paid the 50 naira without a word. Mama Naneka had turned this over for 2 days afterward without being able to fully explain what she had seen. A boy of about 11 who sold pure water sachets from a cooler at the far end of the row brought Constance one sachet each morning without being asked and without asking for anything in return. He had done this since the 3rd month she arrived at the spot. She had tried to pay him twice. Both times he had shaken his head. The 3rd time she held out a coin he had run away, which she had understood as a no. He came at 7:31 a.m. most mornings. He set the sachet on the corner of the table and kept walking without stopping. She drank it slowly over the first hour and always put the empty packet in the gutter clip at the edge of the table, not on the ground. The pension office Constance had visited after her teaching career ended sat on the 2nd floor of a concrete building on Agbani Road, whose ceiling fans had not turned since 2011. The records officer was a man named Mr. Tabena Ize. His name tag was always slightly crooked on the lapel. He had told Constance on her first visit in July 2013 that her contribution records from 1982 to 2013 were pending verification and to return in 6 to 8 weeks. She returned. She returned a second time and a third and a fourth. On the 5th visit, a junior officer she had not seen before told her the records had been transferred during an office relocation in 2016, 3 years after her first pending verification, and would take additional time to locate. 6th visit, 7th. On the 8th, she sat in the chair outside Mr. Tabena Easy's door for 31 minutes before his assistant came out and said he had not been able to return from a regional coordination meeting and would she like to reschedule. She did not return for a 9th visit. The morning of the Wednesday that Collade's driver stopped at the junction began the same as the 1,401 mornings before it. Constance woke at 5:30 a.m. in the flat on Obiagi Road, made tea from the gas ring in the kitchen, and stood at the window for 15 minutes watching the street come awake. At 5:53 a.m. she checked her phone and found a text from an Enugu state government number. It said her pension inquiry had been reviewed. Her case required additional documentation. She should submit her original letter of employment dated at commencement of service, authenticated by her former institution. A processing fee of 5,000 naira was applicable. Original letter of employment dated at commencement of service, January 1982, 42 years ago, in a school now operating under a different name and a different management, having replaced 47 teachers in 3 days and been run since by people none of those teachers had ever met. She had looked for that letter in 2013. It was not in the flat on Obiagi Road. She read the text 3 times with the tea going cold in her hand and then put the phone in her apron pocket and went to collect her stock. She arrived at the junction at 7:22 a.m. The November heat was already on the pavement. By 9 in the morning, the sun had cleared the buildings and come fully onto the street, and the concrete held it the way concrete holds heat, not only in the air but in the surface itself, coming up through the soles of the rubber sandals in a slow, steady transfer. The smell at that hour was citrus and exhaust, and the chemical note of a generator running somewhere above the provision store across the road. Motorcycles moved through the junction between the cars with speed and no particular permission. A bus going toward New Haven leaned on its horn for 11 seconds, for a reason nobody on the pavement could identify. Nobody moved slowly. Everyone was going somewhere. A young man stopped at the table at 9:03 a.m. to buy oranges for his mother and counted his money twice and came up short. He was 200 naira under, and he knew it before Constance finished counting. She could see him knowing it in the way his eyes moved away from the coins. She told him the shortfall and said he could bring the balance tomorrow if he wanted the oranges today. He thanked her and took the oranges. At 11:15 a.m. he came back with 200 naira and said good morning. She said good morning and wrote the balance in the exercise book. 2 months before this Wednesday, in the 2nd week of September, a man had stopped at the table while buying pawpaw and looked at Constance the way someone looks when they are trying to place a face from a different context. He had been in his early 30s, shirt cuffs rolled, with the manner of someone recently arrived at a professional confidence that still sat slightly loose on his frame. He said his name was Mecca and that she had taught him Form 2 English in 2001. He remembered specifically that she had returned his essay once with the word better written at the bottom in red ink, not a grade. Not a tick, just that single word, which had felt at the time like an instruction and had stayed with him. She confirmed she remembered him, though she did not by name, not from 23 years away. He looked well. She said she was glad. He had asked about the fruit table, and she had explained briefly the letter, the pension, the visits to Agbani Road. He had taken her phone number, said he knew people in the education ministry, and said he would make some calls and see what could be done. He had seemed sincere. She had not heard from him in 8 weeks. She had not sent a follow-up message, because pressing a person who has volunteered to help you requires a kind of hope she had decided by October to spend with more care. The sun came through the split in the parasol and lay a line across her shoulder. At 9:41 a.m., when she was arranging the second batch of plantains, 11 meters away, at the traffic light at Chime Avenue, a gray car stopped on the red signal. The door on the passenger side opened. She watched the man come across the road, tall, a linen suit the color of sand, unhurried. He stopped at the table. She picked up an orange and held it toward him. "Good morning, sir. These are fresh today," said Mrs. Acheby. She looked at his face the way you look at a face you are trying to find inside a different, younger face, the suit inside a school uniform. 46 in 9 seconds. Then she set the orange down. "Khaled," she said, "if this story is reaching you the way I think it is, subscribe now, because what he says next is something he has carried for 20 years without knowing where to put it." He said, "I know about the exam fees." She said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "I know." The second time was quieter than the first, which made it land differently. In 2003, when Khaled was 17, and in his final year at government secondary school, his West African Examination Council registration fee of 400 naira had not been paid because there was no money for it. His father had been out of work since February of that year. His mother sold groundnuts near the post office and averaged between 600 and 800 naira on a good day. He had arrived at school on the registration deadline morning and sat on the concrete step outside the main building at 7:48 a.m., not asking for anything, not making a scene, just sitting, because sitting was the only thing that made sense while he worked out what came next. Constance had found him there at 7:54 a.m. She had asked one question. He had answered. She had gone back inside. He was told that afternoon that his fees had been covered by a school bursary arrangement and that he should go for registration. He went. He passed his examinations with 5 distinctions. He received a full scholarship to the University of Lagos. He did not ask further questions about the bursary because he was 17, and the question had seemed at the time to have answered itself. He found out the truth 2 years later in Lagos from a school clerk named Paulinus, who was visiting his brother and who mentioned it over a bottle of Coke at a roadside stall with the ease of someone releasing information he had held too long. There had never been a general bursary arrangement at the school in 2003. What there had been was a directed salary deduction, authorized in a specific teacher's own handwriting, submitted to the bursary account as a personal contribution of 400 naira per month for 6 consecutive months, totaling 2,400 naira exactly. The deduction had been processed so quietly that the headmaster had not known. The clerk had filed the paperwork without comment and had found the whole thing unremarkable until years later it was not. Khaled had gone back to Enugu in December of his second year at university, walked to government secondary school, and stood for a moment outside the window of her classroom. She was at the blackboard, explaining standard deviation to a group of Form 4 students who were not at full attention. He had stood there long enough to see the room, and then had not gone in. He had told himself he would come back when he had something proper to bring. He had become very busy with other things. He looked at her now across the fruit table. Mama Naneka, 3 meters to the left, had a handful of pepper she was no longer sorting. She had gone very still. Constance said, "You turned out well." Khaled said, "Because of you." She said, "Because of yourself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how long she had been at the table. She said 4 years. He asked about the pension. She told him calmly, in the order the facts had occurred, without embellishment, the letter from Gerald Obi, the 8 visits to Agbani Road, Mr. Tabena Eze, and the pending verification, the text that morning asking for a 1982 employment letter and a 5,000 naira processing fee. She finished and picked up an orange and held it briefly and set it back down. Khaled said, "Give me until Thursday." She began to say something. He said, "Thursday." The letter that arrived at the Enugu State Teachers Pension Board on Agbani Road on Thursday morning came from the offices of Adeyemi Ez and Partners in Lagos. It requested on behalf of Mrs. Constance Nwaneka Chebe the full production of all contribution records from January 1982 to June 2013, together with the names of all officers who had processed, reviewed, or declined to progress a related inquiry between 2013 and the present date. The letter was carbon copied to the Enugu State Ministry of Education, the National Teachers Institute, and a journalist at a Lagos newspaper whose public accountability column had, in the previous 7 months, generated 3 formal government responses and 1 ministerial review. Mr. Tabenez returned the call within 90 minutes. This was the first time in 11 years of working in that office that he had returned a call within 90 minutes. The records had not been lost. They had never been lost. They were in a green filing cabinet on the 3rd shelf from the bottom in the storage room, adjoining the main records. Office misfiled under the spelling Asibe rather than Achibe, a single-letter difference that had placed her file between 2 folders belonging to entirely unrelated persons and made it technically unfindable in the index while remaining entirely present in the building, in good condition, in a labeled cabinet, on a shelf any person could reach without a step. 31 years of monthly contributions, 11 years of accrued interest, a total of 2.3 million naira owed to a woman selling fruit under a parasol with a split seam. The payment was issued within 6 business days. Not from goodwill, because Cole's attorney had filed a formal notice of administrative complaint requiring a statutory response within 5 working days under state civil service regulations, and the board's own legal officer had advised in writing that non-compliance carried a greater institutional risk than compliance. Mr. Tabenez was placed on administrative leave pending a review of his handling of the Achi file and 11 others identified in the initial examination. 8 of those 11 also had misfiled records, 6 under variant spellings, 2 under numerical filing errors introduced during the 2016 office relocation. The external audit Colade funded examined all in 47 active teacher pension files in the state. It cost 4.7 million naira, ran for 8 months, and found 61 additional irregularities affecting teachers whose contributions had been correctly made and incorrectly processed, shelved, or rendered unfindable by a single-letter error in a filing index. He named the audit the Achebe Pension Review. He told Constance the name on a Friday afternoon when he called to say the check had been issued. She said the name was too much. He said it was not enough. He also did something smaller. Near the site of the former government secondary school on Oguta Road, now a private institution under a different name, there was an unused ground-floor storage room the new administration had not been able to let for 3 years. Colade's company acquired the lease. The room was cleared, painted, and fitted with 6 tables, 24 chairs, a whiteboard, and a full set of current secondary school mathematics textbooks. A sign was fixed above the door, Achi Mathematics Learning Center, open 4 days a week, 3 to 6 p.m. No admission fee for students from low-income households. He offered Constance the director's position. She took it. She stopped going to the fruit table on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January. She packed the crate and the exercise book and the yellow parasol with the split seam along the right panel. She told Mama Naneka she would not be coming back to the spot. Mama Naneka asked where she was going. Constance said she had found something else to do. Mama Naneka asked if she was sure she was all right. Constance said she was fine and that she would pray for Mama Naneka's business. Then she walked toward the bus stop without looking back. Mama Naneka watched her go. She watched for a long time before she turned back to her mat. Gerald Obi's letter had determined that Constance Nwaneka Achebe was no longer necessary to a modern curriculum. The pension board's filing index had determined that her 31 years of contributions occupied a space effectively outside the reach of anyone who might look for them. A former student had taken her number and said he would call. A landlord had raised her rent and given her a deadline. None of these decisions had been made with cruelty. None of them required cruelty. They required only the ordinary motion of indifference. A letter signed by someone no one has met, a name spelled 1 letter wrong, a number saved and not dialed. What none of that motion could file or relocate or misplace was what Constance had built in 31 years at the front of a classroom. She had calculated in her head what other people reach for paper to do. She had found the one subject a student was still paying attention to when everything else had gone dark, and she had pulled the mathematics lesson through that door. And she had looked at a 17-year-old sitting on a concrete step on a deadline, mourning, and made a decision that cost her 400 naira a month for 6 months, filed the paperwork in her own handwriting, and told no one, not because she wanted credit later, but because it had not occurred to her that credit was a thing she was owed. You may know someone who did something like that. Not a teacher, not necessarily a neighbor, someone from your church, someone who was at a market stall or a hospital corridor or a bus stop at exactly the right moment, who did something for you at a cost to themselves and said nothing about it and went on. The world does not announce these people. It keeps them in the same spot they have always occupied, doing what they have always done, and lets you pass them 1,000 times without recognizing what you are passing. The ones who do the most for us are often the ones who ask the least. That is what makes them easy to forget. It is not what makes it right to forget them. On a Tuesday morning in February, in a room on Oguta Road with 6 tables and a whiteboard and a new sign above the door, Constance Nwanika Achebe stood at the front of 14 students between 12 and 16 years old who had no access to a private tutor and who were, at that moment, sitting with a problem she had written on the board 5 minutes before. She had written it in the same block print she had used for 31 years. She had stepped back from the board, looked at the room, and said in the tone of voice that had once made a man at a fruit table recount his own coins without being asked, "Think first. Don't reach for the pen yet. Just think." The room went quiet. The chalk dust settled. Through the window came the sound of Oguta Road moving in the way that Oguta Road always moved, without particular hurry, going where it was going. The students sat with the problem. They thought, if there is someone in your life who did something for you at a cost to themselves and said nothing about it, who never called to collect, never used it, never once made you feel what it had cost, what would it mean to them if you went back? Not to repay it, just to say, "I know, I have always known." Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.